Hello, and welcome to Keep It Colorful. My name's Jessie Robertson, and today I want to show you some of my favorite palette knife techniques that you can apply to your own paintings. One of my favorite things about the palette knife is the texture that it creates. It creates beautiful, rustic textures that you just can't achieve with a brush. To start, you're going to need something to paint on. You can paint anything with a palette knife that you would paint with a brush. Today I'm working on a stretch canvas, but I use palette knives on my paintings on paper. Just always remember to use paper that can hold up to the weight and scrubbing and water in the paint. So you want to use a thick paper like an acrylic or watercolor paper. For paints, you want to make sure that your paint is heavy body. The palette knife is all about creating thick, bold textures, scraping, and it's a lot easier to achieve some of those textures when we work with a heavy body paint, which just means a thick paint. Some of the more runny paints can work as well, but I do find they can settle into each other, especially when we're doing techniques like scumbling, which I'll show you in just a moment. 3 of my favorite heavy body paints are Liquitex Heavy Body. This is a really old paint. It's been around forever, and it says Heavy Body in bold right on the front of the tube. The Winsor & Newton Galleria series makes a wonderful heavy body paint. I find it's heavy as well as being nice and buttery, so this is one of my favorites. Another one of my favorites for palette knife is Golden, and not the Open series that takes a long time to dry, just their regular Golden Artist colors. And this paint, you can tell, is one of my favorites. I've just squeezed out the last of this tube here for our titanium white. When choosing your palette knife, you don't need anything fancy. You'll notice there's 2 types of palette knives. Some palette knives have a little bend in them like this. This is called a trowel style palette knife. And some palette knives come just straight out from the handle without this little bend down here. I want you to try both until you know which one is your favorite. I prefer the bend because it gives me a little bit more flexibility and dexterity without having my hand right in the paint. So this is the trowel style. You'll also notice that all of the heads are different shapes and sizes, and they're all used in the exact same way. We're either using the long edge, the flat underside, or the tip of our palette knife to make marks. I always buy more palette knives than I actually need, but my absolute favorite 2 palette knives are the diamond head palette knives, like these. And this is a diamond head too, it's quite large. So these are great when covering backgrounds or working on a larger area. Some diamond head palette knives come to a rounded tip. You'll find some that come to a really pointy edge, and both are really fantastic palette knives. If you're just starting out, you'll find you can get sets at your local art store or on Amazon, and they're not very expensive. You want a nice, good quality palette knife? My favorite are the metal kind, the metal heads, stainless steel, with a nice solid wood base. It's nice to have a little bit of weight in your hand because the palette knife kind of drops down, and the gravity, you'll find, does a lot of the work for you. For today's demonstration, I'm going to be using these 2 palette knives here. The last thing I want to tell you about the palette knife shapes is the length of the handle is quite important. When it comes time to grabbing and mixing paint, you want a long, flexible knife. This will allow you to grab paint and maneuver around easily because of that flexible tip. So I want you to find a metal palette knife that's long with a flexible edge. The shorter palette knives don't flex, so if I'm pulling paint up, a lot of it's going to stick on that brush, and it's a little bit harder to mix around with these little guys. But these little ones are fantastic for getting into smaller spaces, or if you're someone that loves working on smaller canvas sizes. The only other thing you're going to need to do your palette knife painting is a little bit of paper towel or an old rag. Unlike brushes, you clean your palette knife right away after you use it, and in between each color by just wiping it like this into your paper towel. This is everything we need to get started, so let's practice some techniques. Just like a singer warms up before giving a performance, I like to revisit techniques every time I start a major painting. And no matter how long you've been using the palette knife for, it's good to bring it back down to the basics and get into those techniques to warm up before a big work. The first technique that I want to show you is called scumbling. When we're picking up paint for a palette knife, it's important to start with a roll. So I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to smooth out almost like a long runway of paint. Once I've got my runway, I'm going to wipe off the excess paint, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to cut a little roll off the end just like this. So I want to cut off a little roll. Scumbling is a technique where we're going to rub very gently, pull or rub very gently over the surface of our painting. And what that does is it creates a broken texture and allows whatever is underneath to shine through. So there's two really great types of scumbling I wanted to show you that I love using, and one is the drag. So I'm going to put my brush down, my knife down, on a little bit of an angle, and I'm going to push very gentle. I'm going to pull, I'm going to drag across, and this is going to allow me to have some lovely breaks in my paint as I pull and as I drag. So dragging across the surface gives you these broken marks, and this can look really wonderful when we're creating things like rocks or an old painted wall, a rustic wall. And here I dragged this way. You can also drag down, scumble down. The trick is not to push too hard and to allow that paint to break. And here is how that scumbling looks up close. It creates a lovely, thick, broken, rustic texture. So that's dragging both vertically and horizontally to scumble. You can also scumble in a circular direction. And this is great for creating things like suns or the base of a flower. So for this, I'm going to put paint on the full, instead of coming in on an angle and creating a roll, I'm going to put the whole flat side of my knife down. I'm going to get a bit of paint on the whole underbelly. And then I'm going to, again, gently with my knife, I'm going to start to rub gently. And you can create wonderful shapes. Again, if you're doing a large painting, it's going to create the look of rocks or stones, suns, or the nice base of things like flowers. So again, scumbling is a way of creating texture that is broken and rustic by pushing gently and allowing what's underneath to shine through. In this case, it's a white canvas, but if I had a whole painting of blue underneath and I put white on top, scumbled with white on top, it would be a lovely broken texture showing the blue from below. Always try to remember to wipe that palette knife off before the paint dries on it. If your paint does dry, just go into some water before wiping and give it a good wipe. The next technique I want to show you is how to create lines. Lines are quite fun to do with a palette knife. So again, I'm going to make a roll. Let's use our cerulean blue for today. I'm going to make myself a long roll, clean off the knife. And for making lines with your palette knife, you want to make sure you've got a nice amount of paint right along the edge of your palette knife. So get a nice little roll right along the edge. And I can hold the palette knife perpendicular and just pull. Now, isn't that a lovely line? You will have to reload your knife almost every time to get a really sharp line like this. And barbed wire on a fence, the crests on waves, it's still a bit of a rustic and broken line. Now if I want to thicken this line, instead of going straight up and down, I'm just going to angle my knife down a little bit more. I'm going to get a thicker line. I can angle down even more and pull. And isn't that wonderful? I use this technique often for wires on a fence, for lines in a door, or for the crests on waves, or even little waves off way in the distance. Not only can you create physical straight lines, but you can also carve into paint with a palette knife. So there's lots of wonderful ways to create line work. So let's give ourselves, say, a background. So let's paint ourselves a fresh, thick background of cerulean blue acrylic. Here we go. This is our background. Or maybe it's a sky. We can carve lines into here as well. So here I'm carving vertically, but not just vertically. I could say carve some beautiful organic lines. Maybe this is a tree. I want to create some beautiful branches in here. And what's really lovely about this technique is it allows what's underneath to show through. So if I had, say, painted brown underneath, then I could create a really lovely look of, say, a tree and such thick, luscious texture. Another one of my absolute favorite palette knife textures is created using a technique called impasto. Impasto is where we take thick blobs of paint and we apply it to our canvas to create massive amounts of bold texture. Typically, impasto is saved to the end of a painting, so you'd pull in your scene, your foundation, if you're either using just your palette knife or using a brush as a base, and then adding this on as texture. So this is great for things like flowers. And I'm going to switch to my smaller palette knife here just because it's a bit easier to get in a little space. And I'm going to show you how to do impasto. So let's do a little flower, say. So I'm going to grab the paint on the tip of this brush, and then I'm going to keep it thick and juicy, and I'm just going to pull in a little dollop. And isn't this fun? Now to do a flower, I do need to work kind of around in a circle. So I'm going to come in here, another little juicy mark. I'm just going the tip into my palette knife. Woo, each and every time. So boy, does this ever use a lot of paint, but isn't it luscious? This kind of texture. You definitely can't get quite the same effects with our paintbrushes. So here's just a little 5-petal flower, and just look how thick and wonderful that is. It doesn't have to be just flowers, you know, you could do long lines with this as well. So if you wanted to have some, so again, working with a roll, you know, thicker strokes on here. Can. So really highlighting your canvas with really thick, bold, texturized brush strokes. Oftentimes an artist will do their entire painting just using the palette knife. So this last technique is one of my favorites. It's a way to cover your entire canvas in color and to do it in a gradient. So for things like skies. You can do a gradient as long as you have at least 2 colors, but I've got 4 here, so let's pull a gradient on in 4 colors. I'm going to pull out my long palette knife here, and I'm going to wipe off in between colors. I'm going to start by applying each color in the gradient. Just a little patch. I'm just wiping off in between so I don't contaminate those other colors. So here we've got our gradient, and we want to, just like with the Scumbling, at least give ourselves a bit of a roll, making sure we've got all of the colors on our knife here. And isn't this fun? Looks amazing and juicy already. So let's pull a little gradient down here. Just holding on an angle and then pull to make it a bit more blended. So that's a sharp gradient. I'm just gonna keep hovering a little bit until I get a lovely pull of color. You can also create a gradient by applying paint right to your canvas. So this would be more of like a sky when we have our gradient be horizontally. Get these juicy colors on here. Nice big blobs, wipe off in between. Okay, so very similar. Make sure your palette knife is clean. We're We're going to do the same thing. We're just going to swoop over here. And there's a nice kind of thick gradient. So to blend it, we're just going to hover. Oh, I could just do this all day. And isn't that fun? Got some extra paint on here. Swoop it down. Even the palette knife looks pretty now. So the palette knife does really, really beautiful filling in large areas of color. So you could do this all with one color to fill in your palette knife. Just use the biggest palette knife you have. You could do it in gradients of 2 for as many colors as you would like. I do most of my palette knife paintings with these 4 techniques. I hope you enjoyed doing these techniques with me. If you would like to do more palette knife painting, let me know in the comment section below a subject matter that you would like a tutorial on.